Let's take a look at what is in the dailies this morning before we get into a conversation. And the top story on the front page of the Daily Nation exposed governors' bad spending habits. Recurrent spending for every 1 shilling put into development. That is for Kisii County. For every 1 shilling spent on development, 99.8 shillings is spent on recurrent expenditure. Meru, 65.6 shillings. Lamu, 38.7, and on it goes. The quest for better roads, schools and hospitals remains a mirage, as development is not a priority for counties, according to spending reports that expose little allocations for growth in the last 6 months. And on this, all 47 governors have violated the law and are guilty as charged. That's the verdict handed down by the Daily Nation. And on the right of the front page, Raila to the West. Don't meddle in our affairs. As Mio Chief laughs off a plan by President William Ruto team to have foreign powers impose sanctions on him. And partly informed by that report by Leila Mohammed Alam, as Kenya's rivers run dry. Kenya is facing her worst drought in 40 years, and the disaster is taking with it the country's major water sources. You heard the U.S. First Lady Jill Biden there ask the rest of the international community to support Kenya's relief efforts. Nigerians wait as vote counting starts. Vote counting is underway in Nigeria's tightest presidential election since military rule ended in 1999. Turnout appeared to be high, with many young first-timers voting in Saturday poll marred by delays, reports of ballot box snatching and attacks by armed men. So that is the front page of the Daily Nation. Let's take a look at the Business Daily. On their front page, this is the headline story. Watchdog forces Jumia to be liable for defective goods. Firm answerable for third-party sellers of faulty goods. Jumia was shielded from defective product liabilities. So do purchase your Business Daily. You can get it on epaper.nation.africa, or if you prefer holding it, you can purchase it from a newspaper vendor near you. So more on this report by Patrick Alushula on page, should be page 2 of the Business Daily. Let's see what else is on their front page. Banks stuck with 330 billion shillings of COVID-19 restructured loans, that report by Charles Waniki. Commercial banks are still holding 330.9 billion shillings worth of restructured loans on their books. Nearly 2 years since COVID-19 relief measures, which allowed for renegotiation of payment terms, expired. So the relief measures which allowed for renegotiation expired. More on this report by Charles Mwaniki on page 2 of the Business Daily. On their ticker, private firms to battle NSSF for new billions in pension. Private financial services firms are angling for a share of billions from enhanced pension contributions following the enactment of the National Social Security Fund Act. Cooperative Bank raises 12.6 billion shillings for lending. The Cooperative Bank of Kenya has raised a total of $100 million in long-term debt from global institutional investors. And I see here Simba Cement Pokot plant opens in August. Front page of the Taifa Leo, Ruto awatetea mawaziri watalii. And on this one, the tourist CSs are as detailed by the Taifa Leo, Dr. Alfred Mutua, Foreign Affairs Cabinet Secretary, Babu Namwamba, Wizara wa Michezo na Utamaduni, Kipchumba Murkomen, Wizara ya Uchukuzi na Barabara, and finally Moses Kuria, Wizara ya Biashara na Viwanda. Moses Kuria did say he spends more time outside the country than he does inside it. In fact, he said he was visiting Kenya at one point. Baadhi yao wakiongozwa na Waziri wa Biashara na Viwanda, Moses Kuria, wamezuru mataifa ya kigeni zaidi ya mara 15 katika muda wa miezi mitano pekee ya serikali ya Kenya Kwanza. And I see down here, magavana wapya adui wa ustawi watumia mabilioni kwa maslahi yao, huku wakitenga pesa 8 kwa maendeleo. And that, I believe, is the same story you will find on the front page of the Daily Nation. Ushoga, mahakama sasa yaona moto kwa uamuzi wake tata. Makanisa yaungana na Waislamu kupinga uamuzi wa kusajili kundi la mashoga, akisema ni kinyume cha makusudi ya Mungu. All right, those are the stories on the front page, highlighted on the front page of the Taifa Leo. The East African Congo war will not be fought on Rwanda soil. President Kagame warns Kinshasa that it has crossed the red line by using FDLR to attack civilians, and Kigali will act at some point. And an image here of Rebecca Miano, Cabinet Secretary, East African Community Affairs, First Lady Rachel Ruto, and FLOTUS Jill Biden. That is the image on the front page of the East African. Nairobi on the spot for edible oil duty waiver. Manufacturers accuse trade and treasury ministers of allowing duty-free imports against EACCT rules. Crude deal, oil marketers cited in Juba loan scandal. More on that in the East African. Let's take a look at the Standard. 1 trillion shilling debt at heart of Kerry purge. Chairman of Kenya Revenue Authority says they are going hammer and tongs against officials of former regime for failing to pay taxes and rewarding themselves with illegal exemptions. There are several quotes here. We have above 1 trillion shillings from tax abandonment, exemption and refunds to undeserving individuals and firms. People think we are fighting a lost cause, but they will be surprised. A quote of Anthony Mwaura, board chair, Kenya Revenue Authority. Another quote here: there are firms dealing with milk and bread that were given, how many billions is that? That were given 5 billion shilling tax refunds as late as last week. We are pushing Kenyans to pay taxes, and the Kerry management were refunding people billions illegally. A quote now of President William Ruto: this country is not the animal farm where some are more equal than others. We are going to have a society where every citizen carries a fair share of our burden to raise their taxes. And yeah, I will leave that there, except for, all right, let's just take a look at the ticker. Here we have Raila, State House march on as planned. Opposition leader says ban from traveling to the U.S. will come between him and the fight to lower the cost of living. Okay, so more on that on page 5 of the Standard. Let's take a look at what they have up here. Governors take on controller of budget over funds. Poll results from Nigeria expected soon. Covering Jill Biden, first-hand account. This one by my colleague Jacqueline, and you can find that on page 3 of the Standard. All right, let's take a look at the Star now. Raila boycotts new IEBC selection panel. Opposition and Kenya Kwanza would have sent a name to make the full list of 7. So I will leave the dailies there and transition us into our conversation. I did mention that I have experts from the United Nations who will be discussing borderland communities. So allow me to introduce them to you. It is my first time hosting them, so please allow me to refer to my notes. I do have them on my phone, and with me in studio this morning we have Dr. Zainu Umar, who's the team lead and Chief Technical Advisor, Africa Borderlands Center, UNDP. And with him we have Bokayo Sora. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Bokayo? Yes. All right, Bokayo Sora, who's the Program Officer, Governance, UNDP. And Dr. Zainu, if you'll allow me to start with you, for our viewers who are watching and are not familiar with the term borderland communities, if I just take the two, if I take the word and I pull it apart, I have border and land. So are these communities that are situated on land across which borders cut? Dr. Ari.
Great. Yes, borderland actually is, it's not a new terminology, but recently it got a lot of actually attention. And borderland, especially in Africa, is a very important geographic region straddling on both sides of the border lines, that international border lines. From our definition, it goes up to 30-kilometer radius. But
70?
30 kilometer
or
radius.
30?
30 kilometer
so
radius.
30 kilometers around?
Radius, yes.
Okay, okay.
From both sides, straddling both sides of the international border line. But in some cases, for instance, in the Horn of Africa, it goes up to, 100 kilometers. If you take, for instance, Marsabit area, the vast array of land that is straddling and Borana side of Ethiopia, so you can go actually around 70 to up to 100 kilometers. But from our definition of borderland, from Africa Borderland Center perspective, we are focusing on 30-kilometer radius of areas that are straddling both sides of the international border.
Okay, and I'm just in the process of pulling down the reports that informs our conversation this morning. This is the report, Promise, Peril and Resilience, Voices of Agro-Pastoralists in Africa's Borderland Regions. And this report is by the United Nations Development Programme, Africa Borderlands Center, released in December of 2022. So not too long ago, actually just the other day. But Bukayo, why is this an important conversation to have, this conversation around the promise, peril and resilience of borderland regions?
Okay, thank you. I think the discussion around the resilience of borderlands, because these are vast areas that cover a long stretch. If we can take an example of the example given by Dr. Zainu of Marsabit County, it's the second largest county in the country, and it borders Ethiopia, and it covers a long stretch. And we really need to take into consideration these border areas, because whatever happens there impacts on other regions. So I think the resilience of, looking at the resilience of these communities, considering the whole issues that are going around, issues of drought, issues of conflicts, really needs to be taken into consideration, because as I said, it impacts on other regions which are also bordering those counties.
Okay. Dr. Zainu, what prompted the release of this report?
Well,
first of all, the commissioning and then the release of the report.
Actually, it is very, very important to have this report to understand the real dynamics going on in the borderland. As I said it earlier, these areas are geographic regions straddling from both sides of the international border, communities sharing several challenges and opportunities, by the way. Both they share, whether in each side of the border, definitely the communities share common culture, common language, common opportunity, and common challenge. For instance, if we take the very serious challenge that we are facing currently in the Horn of Africa, the drought challenge is not abated by the borderline at all, because it can cross easily the border. And if opportunities, for instance, are associated with trade or whatever, opportunities are also immediately can benefit both sides of the communities. So the resilience, promise, peril and resilience of agro-pastoralists research is actually focused on in-depth understanding of these dynamics. How can this community, the agro-pastoral communities in the borderland, how can they survive? What is their sources of resilience? They have been there for over a century, farming and herding. So how, amidst all the challenges they have, be it climate change impact, be it conflict dynamics, be it lack of or absence of or limited statehood presence in these border areas, and lack of policy attention and program level attention, and so on and so forth. These communities are surviving. How do they survive? What is the source of the resilience? Is the most important, actually, aspect of this research. We really, if we really want to do development, we need to identify the potential of the communities. We need to identify the source of resilience of the community. We need to identify how the communities strive amidst all the challenges they have is the most important aspect. So building on those sources of resilience and intervening so that we can ensure development in those areas is the most important aspect of this research. And this research actually really came up with very important findings. 3 important findings were identified.
Okay.
So as a source of resilience. Yeah.
Oh, as a source of resilience. All right, we'll come to that. I just wanted to scroll through the highlights contained in the report as shared with me. And I can see that there are thematic messages here. Mobility is the most critical pathway for accelerating resilience and sustainable development in the borderlands. I scroll down, I see conflict and security threats significantly impact borderland communities despite a positive perception of safety by most of the interviewees for the research. Fluidity and flexibility in income generation activities are central climate change central climate adaptation, I beg your pardon, mechanisms. And even as I go on looking at the highlights of this report, Bokayo, you've worked within these communities. So how far-reaching was this research? How many people did you speak to? Which communities did you traverse?
Okay, I'll request for input from Dr. Zainu on this, okay. Because I know it targeted different regions, not just in Kenya, but different other countries that have borderlands, are bordering with other countries. But in terms of the exact number, I'll request Dr. Zainu to input on that.
Okay.
But of course, these are all communities, as he said, communities that are bordering other countries. For example, in Kenya, we have different borderlands, like Marsabit, Turkana, Busia, because of, okay, like the Mandera Triangle, Mandera, Wajir, those sides which are bordering Somalia. So it's like getting evidence-based information from the different communities which are bordering all these countries. So in terms of the exact numbers, I'll request Dr. Zainu to input on that.
Dr.
Thank
Zainu?
you. Thank you very much. Actually, this research was led by Africa Borderland Center. Africa Borderland Center is a UNDP flagship program center that covers 46 African countries. So when we started this research, it was conducted in 8 countries as a case study. In the east, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Sudan, and Uganda were the case. In the west, Nigeria, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger was the case. So 8-country case study involving actually the survey and in-depth interview of over 1,000 agro-pastoralists, farmers and pastoralists, including women. Actually, 51% of the respondents were women. So that's how we undertaken it. So the most important intention of this research was, as I said it earlier, to understand. For instance, our questionnaires and discussions and so on and so forth were very much focused. You know, for instance, how the communities, for instance, women, agro-pastoralists, understand the climate change impact for the last 5-6 years. How do they understand it from their own perspective, and how do they cope with it. For instance, another very important area that we have identified is conflict. Conflict is one of the thematic areas that we have identified. And how do the women in the borderland of Kenya or Ethiopia or Niger, how do they understand? What does it mean, conflict for them? How do they understand it? And how do they cope with it? Is the most important questions that we were trying to ask. So that means to really understand from the perspective of the communities. And actually, it's so that to elevate these voices, you know, the way they understand the challenges, and not only the challenge part of it, but also the source of resilience, the wisdom of the communities, you know, the knowledge, the hidden knowledge of these communities to adapt with all these challenging situations is also very important aspect of research. So research is well-intended research, and actually to change the narrative. Previous researches, most of the researches that are done in this borderland area, they talk only about the challenges, never mention the amazing potential of the community, amazing, you know, resilience strategy of the community to adapt with these multi-dimensional challenges they are facing. So the uniqueness of this research is it is trying to unleash those huge potentials of the communities that can really be tapped so that and changed into development actually intervention. This is what I want to say. Thank you very much.
All right, so we've touched a bit on the peril that they face, which is conflict, and they're facing climate change. But now Dr. Zainu tells us we also need to focus on the promise and the resilience demonstrated by these communities in facing said challenges. We continue the conversation on the other side of this break.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome back to AM Live. We're back, Daktari, and when I say Daktari, I'm making reference to Dr. Zainu Umar. I butchered it earlier. Dr. Zainu Umar is the team lead tech advisor, Africa Borderlands Center. We're also joined by the governance program officer, UNDP, Bukayo Sora. Good to have both of you in studio this morning. But Dr. Bukayo, before we went on break, you told us that 51 of the respondents surveyed for this report were women. Was that a deliberate decision?
Yes, it was a deliberate decision. You know, communities living in Africa borderlands are around estimated 270 million. So those 270 million people are historically marginalized communities. They are at risk of being permanently left behind in 7 years to achieve Sustainable Development Goal. Women are victims of this historical marginalization, and women shoulders the burden of all those actually multidimensional challenges that Africa borderland communities are facing. So to understand the real dynamics of women in the borderland mean a lot for UNDP, because for UNDP, as part of implementing its SDG in Africa, UNDP is mainly focusing on communities who are at risk of being permanently left behind and more vulnerable. So women are in borderland are a very vulnerable section of society. So we are actually focusing on women because of this reason. Thank you.
All right.
Just an addition to what Dr. has said. Women, if you look at the different challenges that are being faced by the borderland communities, women are the ones who feel the impact more. For example, drought. Like most of the men are out with their livestock, So the ones who are left at home are the ones who are are women who are taking care of their families, and even for the weak animals which are being left at home. If it's conflict, the ones who face more impact are the women, because if it's fight, like they are the ones who lose their husbands, they are left widows at a very early age, left at home to take care of the family, responsibility that are not supposed to be done by them. So I think it's a deliberate effort by UNDP to ensure that women, as one of the groups of those who are being left behind, the LNOB group, are being taken into consideration. Their views are being taken into consideration, and also to know what recommendations fits them best, so that they are being supported.
Okay.
Thank you.
And Bokai, I'm curious, how did you get into this line of work?
Of
working with these communities.
Working with the communities?
Yes.
The borderland communities?
Yes.
Okay, personally I come from Marsabit, so I'm also from the borderland community. So I understand them, I understand the issues that these communities go through. Not from the point of working, but from the point of being brought up in those areas. So I understand what it means to be in these border areas, to be vulnerable communities which face the impacts of conflict, the impacts of drought, and all challenges that are being faced by the borderland communities.
All right.
Yeah.
So are there findings in this report that resonated with you?
Yes, of course. For example, the issues on conflicts, personally coming from those areas, like for example Marsabit, we know the issues that have been going on in those areas, especially like the last few years, the conflict situation in those areas. If we talk of mobility, like what is being highlighted as the Matic areas, these communities are the same. To them, border is just an imaginary line.
Yes.
They are all the same. We have communities across Ethiopia. We have communities, like we share the same culture, the same, like everything. When there is no pasture and water in the side of Kenya, livestock cross over to Ethiopia. There are children who are in Ethiopia, but they come schooling in for example, Moyale, Kenya. Kenyans on Moyale side cross over to Ethiopia to get goods for sale, trade, or like what we are saying of borderlands. It's imaginary to these communities because they are the same across border. Yeah.
Okay. So Dr. Zainu, why is that an important consideration? That for many, that border, that line is imaginary, that they are one people regardless.
Exactly. That's actually the main purpose of Africa Borderland Center, to fill this very important structural gap. Our development intervention, all our development interventions are territorially bounded. But these communities, they can, the borderline is not in the mind of these communities. They share the challenge, they share the opportunities, and there is no structure that follows this interaction of the community. So to address this interaction or following the suit of the communities themselves, it is very important to have a borderland lens. A borderland lens means cross the entire, region of the border areas, either straddling this side or the other side, because the communities living either this side or that side are the same and similar. So can we really create a development arena that can be in tandem with this context is the most important aspect of the Africa Borderland Center. And at the same time, because of the remoteness from the center, these communities, are not, given due attention both at the policy and program level from their respective countries. So it is very important to create a development context that can address, from regional perspectives that can address this. The communities living in this geographic region is actually the key focus of UNDP. Thank you.
So, Bukayo, is governance then at the heart of addressing the peril that they face and also supporting their efforts at resilience?
Yes, that is very key. And one most important thing is, however much, for example, we try to sort out issues on the Kenyan side, if the other end will not put the same effort, then it is meaningless. So there's need for example, if we put into consideration all governance issues across the different levels, be it the community, be it the county governments, the same needs to be replicated on the other side. Because if this side is sorted and the other side still has issues, then we might not be able to achieve what we want to achieve. Mm-hmm. So there's need for government across board. For example, on the Kenyan side, Ethiopian side, Kenyan side, Ugandan side, or Kenyan side, Somalia side, for example, in the case of Kenya, to put all efforts to supporting these border communities. Because if anything happens on communities across the other country, since these communities are the same, it flows down to the communities on the other side. So there's need for all sides to put equal measures in supporting the different communities who are living across the borderlands.
So they request a special consideration, yes, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Dr. Zainu, why is it that this population of 270 million have been left so far behind? Because you said, first of all, is it 270 million across the continent? And then you also brought up the issue of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have 7 years to attain those targets of zero poverty, zero hunger. Why have they been left so far behind, do you think?
Yeah, I think these communities, they are left behind. It is only because of actually lack of, because of his historical marginalization at the policy level. Governments, they are living in a remote area. As I said it earlier, the development agendas are actually, all the development actors are involving, they base their development agenda on the national development plan of the country. So when the national development plan of the government is designed, the attention given to this community is very little. They are historically marginalized communities. That's why they are facing multidimensional challenges: conflict, lack of state presence, infrastructure, service, climate change impact. Many of the challenges are not properly addressed. So because of that, they face multi-dimensional challenges. But it doesn't mean that these communities do not have potential. They have a lot of ingenuity, and they have a lot of potential. They have a lot of resilience. They are not only survivors, but thrivers amidst all these challenges for the last centuries. So when we identify this community for the development, for the SDG implementation, because there is a potential, not only the challenge, there is a potential, there is amazing resilience, there is amazing effort of this community. There is huge potential of human resource. There is huge potential of natural resource. If tapped properly, if these communities are supported, if we identify what they lack, and what they have and what they have not, then if we support them on what they have not, definitely these communities can flourish. Development in this area can actually confidently achieve it. But there is a need to, policy level attention. There is a need for program level attention, so that to actually tap this very important opportunity. If these communities are supported and if development is ensured in those areas, they can contribute not only for the national GDP, the GDP of their respective national countries or respective nations, but they can serve as a springboard for the regional integration. You know how much it is important for Africa, you know, this regional integration issue. How, you know, the border communities, we can take a lot of lessons from the European Union, how border communities played in terms of the today's European Union, economically, socially, politically integrated, very coherent continent, Europe. So I think Africa should learn from this and need to invest on those very dynamic communities, tap their potential so that they can serve as a springboard for regional integration. Thank you.
Okay, but haven't we had development partners working in these communities for years?
No. Actually, very little interventions, I can tell you. Because development partners, as I said it earlier, development partners base their development plan on the national development plan of the government. If the government ignores them, how can development partners come to risk them is a big question. So that's why, you know, we are UNDP trying to advocate this is because there is a huge gap, attention gap, at the policy and program level, at the government level, at the development actors level. At the global stakeholder level, there is a huge lack of attention to these communities.
Okay, so let's just take a look at some of the, I do beg your pardon, some of the other highlights contained in the report. We had looked at several prior. My seat out of the way. We had looked at some of the thematic messages we dealt, I highlighted or rather mentioned, mobility, conflict and security threats, fluidity and flexibility in income generation activities. I'm curious, what does this entail? This fluidity and flexibility in income generation activities?
Yeah, you know, the three areas actually are identified as sources of resilience of, or as resilience strategies of these communities. You know, when we try to identify how these communities are thriving amidst all these multidimensional challenges, we found three important key areas that as sources of resilience strategy. The first one is mobility. The second one is diversity. And of course, the third one is very important one is also family. Family tie is a very important strategy. So fluidity in income is very much related to the diversity dimension of the finding. That means unless and otherwise they have alternative way of finding maximizing their income. You know, for instance, when drought happens or when conflict happens, you know, the farming and the cattle herding can be seriously affected. In this case, if they don't have alternative way of finding income, definitely the community's coping strategy will be affected, or their livelihood seriously affected. So to make sure that happen, various income, for instance, informal cross-border trade is one of the very important aspects. Mining, some of the communities also involved in artisan mining. Others are also involved in daily labor activities and so on and so forth. So diversification of income is the most important actually way of you know, coping mechanism. So that's why we are saying that. And mobility, for instance, is also another very important strategy for the farmers and pastoralists. But most of the time it is affected by bad regulations and conflict. For instance, in the current situation of West Africa and sometimes in the Horn of Africa, because of the presence of conflict dynamics, cattle herders cannot move their cattle from one place to another. When drought happens, better pasture, better water, So if there is this flexibility of movement, it gives them a chance to save their cattle from climate change impact like drought. But if conflict is there, if bad policy or border barrier is there, definitely they cannot do that. So because of that, the cattle, they lose their cattle, they definitely their livelihood seriously be affected. So investing in mobility, facilitating mobility, investing in facilitation of mobility for agropastoralists or on transhumance is the most important area that needs to be worked on.
Okay. Just an addition.
Yes.
Most of these communities, as they are now, depend on their livestock as their source of income. But as it is now, because of the current drought, there are families that have lost almost all their livestock.
Yes.
So you can imagine in that case, these are families who do not have an alternative income. They depend on their livestock, they depend on their farms 100%.
Yeah.
But if they've not farmed, if the livestock that they have, they could not sell. Some could even sell a goat that usually costs like almost 10,000 shillings is going for like less than 500 shillings. You take it to the market, by the time you get back and you deduct all the expenses, for example, transport and the meals that this person is taking as they go to the market, then by the time they get back, they might have like 100 shillings remaining. Currently, as it is, 100 shillings cannot even buy you a 1 kg sugar. Yeah. It cannot buy you a 2 kg or even a 1 kg flour. So if they are totally depending on this livestock, I think in the next 2-3 years to come, we might be having a lot of crisis because of course, if you've lost all your livestock, or even if you have 2 or 3 remaining, with the heavy rains coming, even the 3 will go. So you can imagine the kind of situation these communities are in if there's no alternative, if they are not introduced to any alternative income generation that they are not used to. So there's need to have that deliberate effort to introduce these communities to alternative income generation activities for them to get, besides the livestock they have, besides the farms they have, for them to get something else as an income to the families.
Okay.
Yeah.
You told us that, I see Dr. Umar would like to add something to that?
Yeah, I think that's very, very important. In the current situation, for instance, most of the, because of the drought, especially in the Horn of Africa, most of the cattle herders lost majority of their cattle. They cannot, as she said it, they cannot even sell their cattle out because, the demand for cattle market is down because everybody is trying to sell his cattle to save, to avoid the days of his cattle, just to make sure that he sold his cattle before the day it dies. So, so as she said, if this situation persists, there is a high probability of the borderland communities to lose all their cattle if they don't have alternative means of. And crop production is also very become very challenging. It is impossible in the absence of rain, in the absence of water. It is impossible to produce crop. And the food price, today's food price, staple food price is very, very high. So how can this community will survive unless and otherwise they do have an alternative means of income? Is a very critical issue that needs to be raised. Thank you.
So are you saying that the governments across, let's say, for example, let's take northeastern Kenya, which borders Somalia, Ethiopia. Are you saying these governments should recognize that informal cross-border trade as opposed to penalizing it, because it could be viewed as smuggling?
For UNDP, smuggling and informal cross-border trade are very different things. You know, smuggling is illegal, and informal cross-border trade is, it has been there for over a century, especially mainly traded by women. The word informal means unregistered. Only it is unregistered, legally unregistered, but in some other countries, for instance, in Livingston and Vic, you know, women traders are paying, you know, tax even if they are not registered. The income of the Livingston town authority, city council, actually he was telling me that 40% of the income for that the town is this informal cross-border trade. So some governments in Africa actually give, you know, legal status and tax it and promote it, you know. So it is very important to understand it this way. It's not the one that is smuggling, involved illegal smuggling and so on and so forth. So I think this should be, you know, something that really needs to be supported by the government at the policy level and encourage it, because it can serve as also the bigger trade. For instance, we are now at the era of implementing the AFCFTA, Continental Free Trade Area, which is adopted by the member states of African Union, and it was this year's theme of the summit, actually.
Yes.
So if really we are committed, our policymakers are committed to implement the AFCFTA, how can we start it? You know, we have to start it from there, from the border communities, from encouraging this informal cross-border trade, giving a leeway, a legal route, so that the people can trade each other, and make their living and create employment opportunity out of it. Thank you.
I think there is probably need to have a deliberate effort to come up with legal and policy frameworks to support these border communities. You know, like instead of impeding cross-border mobility, there's need to have those deliberate efforts to facilitate these communities, because of course,
and these are the lanes that Dr. Umar was talking about. Okay.
Yes, yes. Such that if there are, for example, women or youth who are having those, like taking goods from this country and coming and selling them to a different country, like just have a way of formalizing it, have that formal movement across the different countries, so that these communities do not fully rely on livestock. Because with this, initially, few years back, drought used to be like coming after 4 years, 5 years. But currently, as it is, every year is a drought period. For example, like for the last, I think, like almost 6 seasons, we've not had rain.
Yes.
And without rain, if these communities are depending on rain for them to harvest, for them to take their livestock out, then if the same trends continues, and I think from the climate change and what is happening around, of course we might not see much difference in the next probably few years. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Something else that is highlighted in the report is agro-pastoralists perceive, as you mentioned, Bokayo, climate change as the biggest long-term threat to their survival and development. More than insecurity, agro-pastoralists perceive climate change, that is what the report shows, as the major source of future displacements, poverty, conflicts, and all the associated losses, women and children already bear the disproportionate impact of environmental challenges. Borderland communities have taken responsibility for incrementally addressing the effects of climate change-induced damage and losses. And however, sustainable adaptation mechanisms which guarantee prosperity, stability, and development are lacking. What does this statement mean, Dr. Umar, that the borderland communities have taken responsibility for incrementally addressing the effects of climate change-induced damage and losses?
Yeah, the communities try their best, by the way, from our research. The communities try their best to cope with the climate change impact, because they try several their own way of adapting to the climate change impact. But the existing one is it is beyond them. I can tell you. This is for me personally. I don't believe this climate change impact is. For instance, drought, the recurrent drought in the Horn of Africa is, natural. It's mainly, I can say, man-made, policy-made, I can say. You know why I say this? Because
I'm curious.
Millions of kilometers of groundwater is just lying in the borderlands of the Horn of Africa. If there was really adequate policy attention, this community, let me tell you, if they get water is 70% problem of this community is water. If they get water, definitely they can, survive. They can produce crop, they can produce their animals properly, and they can make their living, better in a better way. So how can we utilize this potential? How can we adopt a policy to invest on this kind of groundwater utilization? Is, by the way, the most important aspect. That's why I am saying it is man-made or policy-made problem, not natural problem. Nature gave us huge amount of water as a ground. We need to have, a means and a way and a policy and a strategy to utilize this water. Farmers can engage in, producing animal fodders, and herders can use the animal fodders produced by. We can create value chain. We can create horizontal integration of the development, and both farmers and pastoralists can grow together and really contribute for the development of the entire their respective nations. But it is because of the absence of the adequate or appropriate policies that they are paying really a serious price. So it's not only in the Horn of Africa, it is everywhere in the borderland, by the way. If you go to West Africa, it's the same. So the potential is there, but absence of appropriate policy is, creating a recurrent crisis in Africa borderlands. Thank you.
Just an addition to that.
Yes.
Besides having, for example, the water structures, how are the governance of these water structures? Because however much we have, for example, so many boreholes, if not well governed, then it will come to a crisis when most of these boreholes are run down because it's not well governed. There's no, for example, a clear structure of having the water committees be able to run these boreholes, because there's no reason for example, a borehole to be set up, and after a few years, despite these boreholes having income, because any livestock that goes and takes water from these boreholes, they pay for it. So why do we get to a point when this borehole runs down and we get into a crisis, that many livestock die at the point of taking water because the boreholes have run down or it has broken down. So we need to have good governance structures of these structures that are being brought up, so that it's better run and it's better being managed by the communities. And also, like in most of these border areas, we have enough sun. Mm-hmm. We have wind. Why not put up solar panels to pump this water rather than putting up generators that requires fuel, fuel that is too expensive for these boreholes to run?
Interesting point, because I was in Kajiado yesterday with Jill Biden, the First Lady of the U.S., and actually their water source is solar powered, so it can be done. All right, let's also take a look at what else quickly is contained, highlighted in my Mwakenya here on the report. As a unit of social mobilization, the family, and that was mentioned by Dr. Umar, the family serves as the nerve center of mobility and labor diversification. Perhaps you can explain this to us.
Yes, I think family is very important. Family tie in the borderland is very, very actually strong. You know, communities at their time of shock, they can actually survive because of the family support, either from abroad or from the other side of the border or within. So this is that's why it is very important. And also in terms of mobility, you know, for instance, if we take the communities, the Boran communities in Kenya and Ethiopia, you know, no one can stop them from going to Ethiopia, you know, because the family ties, the root is there, and vice versa. So in any, you know, moment of challenge or opportunity or joy, definitely the communities are exchanging the mobility of the community to exchange visits and to support and pay whatever visits and so on and so forth is the most actually common aspect. And it is also identified as very important aspect of survival, because as I said it earlier, you know, when communities face such shocks, definitely the other side, the same families from the other side or wherever comes to risk them. So this is very important.
Okay. But Bukayo, if these are brothers and sisters across the border, where does the conflict stem from?
Okay. You know what happens is, for example, where I come from, there are Boranas on Ethiopia side and there are Boranas on Kenya side. There are Gabras on Ethiopia side, there are Gabras on Kenya side. Same for Gare on either side. And what we fear most is if anything small erupts in Ethiopia side, it will trickle down to Kenya side. If, for example, the Gabras and the Boranas fight on the Ethiopian side, it will trickle down to the Kenyan side.
Oh, so that's why you were saying if governance issues are addressed on one side and not the other.
On the other, then it will not make any sense.
The spillover effect is common.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, understood. Okay, still scrolling through the highlights of the report. Women and youth inclusion are critical to agro-pastoralism, economic viability and sustainability in Africa's borderland, even though men are twice as much as women. The report tells us the latter make the most significant contributions to household income. Climate-related vulnerability has further exacerbated water scarcity, disproportionately impacting women who spend several hours daily finding and collecting water. Addressing sexual and gender-based violence, which is still prevalent in the borderland, is essential to the inclusion of women in the borderland economy. Bukayo, perhaps you can explain that to us. Especially this part on addressing the sexual and gender-based violence. What makes it essential to the inclusion of women in the borderland economy? How big a problem is it?
Okay. Yes, as the report says, one thing that is there across these border areas is water scarcity. And these women walk for distances to get this water. And in between, they can get a lot of challenges. Issues on sexual harassment, like if you walk alone in a vast area and you are all alone, and most of the time they walk alone to get water. And it's not like a few kilometers distance. You can walk for 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers. If it's 3 kilometers, it's not even far. So they experience a lot. And the other issue is most of the time women are left at home alone, and because their husbands go away with their livestock. And of course, if a woman does not have someone to defend, they're always vulnerable. So there are issues of gender-based violence in most of the communities, which needs to, of course, needs to be addressed. And the security of these women needs to be taken into consideration. They really needs to be, of course, the reason why we are also saying these water sources to be brought closer to these communities so that women have lesser kilometers to walk, or they should not be left vulnerable for them to be walking for a longer distance.
Okay, so we need to take a break, but when we come back now, we get into the recommendations contained in this report, and one of which you've mentioned, bringing the water sources closer to these communities, and I'm also curious about the inclusion of youth. How do we achieve that on the other side of this break? I was just scrolling through some of the images contained in this report, and very moving, actually. Look at this. Look at the expression on his face. Jonte, can we take that? Thank you. Closer. You know, it's thought, they say a picture is worth a thousand words, and the one I saw just before that was that of this young man. You know, with his. Let me zoom out so we can also see his cattle and you know, the look on his face and and Bokai, before we took the break, we had, you know, touched on women, but I'm curious, the inclusion of youth around this conversation on borderland communities. Why is it important?
Involvement of youth is very key because, of course, considering also that there are so many youth who are out there who do not have jobs, but given any opportunity, whether good or bad, they can easily get into it. So involvement of youth for these borderland communities, and of course, what happens if it's for example conflict? Who are those going out to fight? It's not the wazes, it's not the old men. These are the young people who have the energy to go out and fight. So for us to have control of this area, and for us to ensure that all concerned parties are taken as are part of the solution of these border areas, then the youth must be given the first opportunity. And we need to have them, for example, be able to share out their views, give them opportunity. Let's not decide for them. Can they be part of a table to discuss their own issues? For example, at UNDP, we have the Youth Sounding Board. The reason why the Youth Sounding Board was formed is for us to bring them on the table, not for us to discuss their issues, but for them to come up with their own solutions with the issues that they have. So it's high time we involve the youth, bring them on board, ensure that not just having them as part of numbers, but ensuring that their views are being taken into consideration and they are being part of the discussions around them.
All right. And
yeah.
you know,
yeah.
Yes, you wanted to add something, Dr.
Yeah,
Umar?
yeah, just to add something. It's very, very important, by the way. By the way, in the borderland, youth delinquency, unemployment, and of course, lack of adequate, appropriate education is very common in the borderland, and their vulnerability is very high. You know that we have to know that these borderlands are, most of the borderland areas are areas where, you know, the most violent extremist groups are operating at the global scale. So the vulnerability of youth. If youth are not, if youth delinquency is high, if youth are not employed, if youth are not educated, so if youth are, frustrated, definitely there is a high chance of recruitment of the youth by these extremist groups. It is common, by the way, in West Africa. So that's why we are saying that the inclusion of youth in socio-economic development is very critical to take them from, actually, to prevent them from being actually joining this violent extremist group and who are operating at the global scale. And definitely, this is a huge risk associated with this thing. Yeah,
okay. Bokaya, you told us about the table where you bring these young people together. That's one of the initiatives UNDP has rolled out. What else is UNDP doing in these areas?
Okay. UNDP, for example, in the last few years, have been implementing cross-border projects. And when we say cross-border, is where project entails 2 or more countries. Mm-hmm. And for example, we had Kenya-Ethiopia and Kenya-Uganda projects that were implemented by UNDP Kenya country office. And of course, we do not cross over to the other country to implement. But what happens is UNDP Kenya implements within the borderlands of Kenya. And then we have our counterpart, for example, from Ethiopia. We have Ethiopia, UNDP Ethiopia country office implementing on the other side of Ethiopia. Now this comes in handy when I was talking about having two countries implementing together for us to sort out issues that are there within the different countries. So we've been implementing the Kenya-Ethiopia, Kenya-Uganda project. And the main reason is to support communities on issues of resilience, to look at the issues on vulnerability, and enhance peace and cohesion between the different communities who are living within the two border areas. And also looking at issues around peace dividends. Peace dividends are where we have projects that are being set up, but it supports both communities from either side. For example, if it's a school that is set up, we had an example of a school in Turkana County, which was supported through the Borderlands project. And the school is situated at the border of Kenya and Uganda. And it's supporting the communities on either side, because children also cross over from the other end. And if we have such structures that brings two communities together, then these are things that enhances social cohesion between these two different countries. The same also for water structures, for example, in West Pokot, in Marsabit, where boreholes are being supported to give at least communities to have water. And as we said, communities move across. So there are times when it's bad on the other end, they cross over for water and pasture. Other things that we've done is livelihood support, especially to the vulnerable youth and women, to give income generation. And here we look at groups that are already there, structured groups, such that it's easier for us to even do monitoring of these groups. And we ensure that we do not tell them what to do, but they are being trained to come up with business plans for them to come up with viable projects that can be implemented in those areas. Yeah, so those are some of the things that that we do at UNDP, especially for the border communities. Of course, also not forgetting capacity building of the different peace architecture within the counties, within the different regions. Training the peace committees on how to handle issues around the border areas, how they can interact well with their counterparts across the borders, so that when issues come up, then they can easily mobilize themselves and sort it out before it escalates much. And also issues of early warning and early response, such that if there is anything that comes up, then it becomes easier for the different authorities to address it before it gets to another level.
Okay. You know, when you talked about peace dividends and the school, I remembered that Dr. Umar was Minister for Peace in Ethiopia. But Bukhari, before I ask what the Africa Borderlands Center is also doing in this respect, I would imagine that Marsabit and Busia are far removed from each other. Do they face similar challenges being borderland communities? I mean, hosting borderland communities?
The challenges are similar because these are all communities at the border. But the only difference probably is the communities, for example, in Marsabit are pastoralists. Like almost 90% of them are pastoralists. So the challenges that they face, for example, of course, for Busia, they might not have to walk or cross over with their livestock to the other end. And livestock is one thing that is making most of these border communities to fight because of conflict over resource, over pasture and water. So if you get into someone else's territory, then that is where the issues come up. But of course, for Busia, they might not have such scenarios. So their issues might be different from the challenges that is being faced by the communities in Marsabit.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And Dr. Umar, what is the Africa Borderland Center doing to address these challenges?
Yes, Africa Borderland Center is actually established with the aim to play catalytic role for development, and at the same time to do advocacy, to elevate the voices of those communities. 270 million people, historically marginalized, at risk of being permanently left behind, unless and otherwise you start from elevating their voices and work with them. Definitely development might not be an easy thing to do. And how can also it is a partnership model. ABC is a partnership model. How can, because anything you invest by UNDP, is not, just dropping a dot in an ocean, So the demand is very high in the borderland. So that to, achieve sustainable development goals, to de-risk these communities from being permanently left behind, definitely multi-stakeholder approach is very critical. So we are working to assure this. We are working with African Union. We are working with regional organizations. We are working with development partners. We are working with government so that to make this thing a concerted effort, both in terms of policy advocacy and in terms of attracting investment to this area rapidly, so that to catalyze development. So we invested, so far we invested a lot in research, because our policy advocacy, our program advocacy should be evidence-based. We did several knowledge products. We did several data and invested on the data. We invested also in innovation. You can see amazing innovation, amazing talents in the borderland. How can we unleash those amazing talents in the borderland and use them to solve the local problems? Innovative ideas, talents, unleash it and use it to solve the local problems. We invested in this innovation issue, 10-country, 10-year experiment, and we have seen a lot of results. Actually, the target was to improve the life of women traders, informal cross-border traders, including women and youth in the borderland. So the critical challenge of how can we improve, actually, for the women traders in this area, the critical challenge, the chronic challenge is access to finance. So how can we really improve this access to finance? We have seen a lot of, innovative way of tackling this challenge by women themselves. They are creating pool funds, for instance. I was in Warawar, South Sudan, and I saw a system, a traditional system called Sanduk. In this Sanduk, they collect money, small money, in a box. Sanduk is a box. So in a box, and then they use it, for as a loan, for traders. But this is a very small, in terms of amount, it is small. It can cover only a small amount of women. And the cost of the money is very high, 30%. You know, for per month, if you take 1,000 shilling, you pay 300 shilling at the end of the month as an interest. So the innovation that we want to bring in is how can we make this pool fund bigger, using their own actually setup. How can we make this fund bigger so that it can cover, if it covers 20 people, 20 women, how can we make it 200 or 2,000 women? How can we lower the cost instead of they are paying the 30%? How can we make it 2% so that they can enhance, maximize their profit? How can we lower its risk? For instance, the money is put in the box in a fragile setting. For instance, if fire is set, definitely everything will burn out. So how can we digitalize it so that it can be, you know, fully de-risked? And this is the kind of innovative work that we are doing in terms of innovation. We are also doing programs, catalytic programs, as I said earlier. What are the accelerators of development in this area? You know, so how can we invest on those areas? For instance, we came up with a very important model, development model. We call it 4-pillar approach, for area-based portfolio approach, and with 4 critical pillars: enhancing production and productivity of farmers and pastoralists, and the development of value and supply chain. This is one pillar. The second pillar is promotion of small and medium enterprises, including informal cross-border trade, and ensuring access to finance. This is one very important pillar. The third is how can we really invest on climate resilient infrastructures, including digital infrastructures. Water, the issue of water is very critical for the borderland. And the fourth one is social cohesion, that Bukayo was explaining. Social cohesion is very important. How can we enhance the capacity of the local authorities, both sides, so that to make sure that they respond to the demands of the citizen, especially the security demands of the citizen? How can we create horizontal social cohesion among the communities themselves? For instance, there is always a conflict. Boran, this you know, tribal and clan-based conflict among the communities are also there. How can we ensure peace building, peace built to make sure that communities are living in a harmony and a peaceful situation? So this 4-pillar approach model, we believe in that if it is invested on, definitely it can address, it can catalyze, it can play a catalytic role in terms of ensuring development in the borderlands. So these are some of the areas that we are working on. Thank you very much.
All right. And you know, when you were speaking, I was pulling up the report on my phone because I remember the subtitle of the report has to do with voices, right?
Yes.
Giving voice. And it says voices of agro-pastoralists in Africa's borderland regions. And Bukayo, even as we have this conversation, and I want to look at the policy recommendations shortly, but what are the opportunities that exist in these borderland communities for those who may want to invest outside? Because, you know, we really focused on the governance aspect of things. Are there areas in which the private sector can collaborate?
Okay. One thing that people should know is, of course, these areas have their own potential. And they have a lot of potential, especially on cross-border trade. There's a lot of potential. For example, looking at Marsabit County, the food, like Moyal, for example, the Moyal area, they rely more on Ethiopia getting food than on this side. So these are things that if frameworks are put in place, a lot of people can benefit, including even the government. And looking at also livestock. The number of livestock that come from, for example, Marsabit, Wajir, Turkana, to even Nairobi is a lot. And if possible, but actually even, why do we even have to bring them all over to Nairobi if market can even be set up in those counties? Because the amount of money that these traders use on transporting the livestock all the way from, for example, Marsabit to Nairobi, you can use like 80,000 Kenya shillings to get a truck to ferry your livestock to Nairobi. So you can imagine, of course, the traders also have income out of that. But if you look at the local person who does not have access to these markets, then they might end up using a lot of their own resources to take their livestock to the closest market. And the closest market that they normally bring to is Nairobi. Mm. So there's a lot of potential in these areas. As Dr. Zainu said, if only we have enough water in these areas, then some of the issues of drought and people complaining about lack of water does not exist. Mm. I can give an example of, there's a location in Marsabit called Kalacha, and it has running water 24/7 at the same pressure for the last I don't know how many years. It doesn't make sense if, for example, in such an area we do not have fodder. So why not put up, look for innovative ideas where we can support the communities at the local level. If, for example, in the same location, farms are set up, irrigation farms, because they will not look for water, they have water. All they need is probably to pipe that water to the different farms. The communities at their own level have small farms, but of course the farms cannot sustain the entire community. And even at this time of drought, they can get some small hay from those farms. But if it's enlarged, if we have it at a larger scale and at minimum price, because they will not look for water, all they need is labor, and probably labor even the community can provide. I think these are things that we need to come up with. Look at innovative ways of supporting these communities, the youth, the women, and they already have things that they've already started. It all needs to upscale whatever they've started so that it is at a bigger magnitude rather than having it at a community level.
Okay. All right, now that I think I have about 3 minutes left, so let's take a look at let's take a look at the policy recommendations. I had pulled them up here. Embrace and facilitate cross-border mobility and regional integration. Prioritize a regional lens in addressing the needs of borderland communities. Be borderland sensitive by acknowledging borderlands as unique socio-economic and geographic entities, and foster new narratives about borderland regions as zones of opportunity, intercultural exchange, and regional integration. And actually, we've just heard from Bokayo that they have the solutions, they just need the support. 5, promote agro-pastoralism as a socio-economic successful livelihood form. Recognize and support alternative non-state service delivery mechanisms in borderland communities. That's interesting. 7, strengthen local governance systems in borderland regions to enhance the presence and visibility of the state and service delivery. 8, prioritize climate change adaptation and invest in data, research, and infrastructure to support borderland communities to cope with the impact of climate change. So I think I've captured the policy recommendations. I won't get into the program recommendations, but as your last comment this morning, so that I can close the show and make way for your world, I'm curious about this one. Where is it? Yes, recognize and support alternative non-state service delivery mechanisms in borderland communities. What does it mean? In 2 minutes at the most, Daktari.
Yeah, I think I will just focus on how can we accelerate development in those areas. I think the most important aspect of this recommendation. You know, we can accelerate development. What are the development accelerators in the borderland? Water is First water, second water, third water.
Ah.
Yes.
Okay.
And the other very important development accelerator in the borderland is finance, access to finance. Communities need the challenge of finance is very chronic, and access to finance is another very important development accelerator in the borderland. Energy is the third one, and market. You know, one of a governor in the borderland, I asked him what exactly your community need. He told me peace, market, and water.
Peace, market, and
peace,
water.
market, and water. So market, finance, peace, water, and energy are critical in terms of accelerating development in those areas. So my call is all the stakeholders, the policymakers, need to invest in those areas. These 5 areas, if they invest in those 5 areas, definitely they will tap the huge opportunity of the potential of these communities for their own respective national domestic product, and at the same time for the regional integration. So this is very critical. Thank you very much.
All right, so allow me to thank my panelists for taking the time to engage in this conversation. I think it's a very important one, especially as we deal with climate change and conflict. We cannot afford to ignore these recommendations. So Dr. Zainu Umar, Team Lead and Technical Advisor, Africa Borderland Center, as well as Bokayo Sora, she is Program Officer Governance, UNDP. Let me say in Kiswahili, asante sana. Have yourself a good morning. My name is Olive Burrows. I will see you tomorrow.